2 days, 2 funerals for members of the Boston Fire Department. Michael Kennedy's funeral drew the same throngs of firefighters from departments near and far. Coming up later this half hour, we'll take you to the streets of West Roxbury and inside Holy Name Church for more from today's funeral procession and mass. I'll also share my story of meeting firefighter Michael Kennedy when he responded to a false alarm at my home last Easter. But we begin with a new report out of Harvard examining what worked and what didn't in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombings. No surprise, the report commends the work of first responders at the finish line, but it also contains some criticism of the melee in Watertown during the chase and search for the bombing suspects. The Harvard report, titled "Why Was Boston Strong?" starts with the first explosion at 2:49 p.m. on April 15th. That unleashed a chaotic and confusing series of events, plunging authorities into the proverbial fog of war. Key to any response, researchers say, was a robust command and coordination structure. On that point, the report notes that Homeland Security, the FBI, and a phalanx of other law enforcement were already on the scene, responding immediately with makeshift medical tents. Consequently, the site was cleared of victims with serious injuries within 22 minutes. And with 8 major medical centers nearby, the report says that, in spite of the hundreds of patients arriving in a relatively short time, all received almost immediate treatment. But as the investigation kicked in, the command and coordination started to fray, with friction between various law enforcement agencies and disagreements over whether to release the photos of the 2 suspects. But with the media breathing down their necks, they decided it was too risky to hold them.
If you see these men, contact law enforcement.
The report acknowledges confusion on the night of the Watertown shootout, starting with a report of a 7-11 robbery, the killing of an MIT police officer,
Where's that ALS unit? Officer down.
And then a carjacking, all leading to the wild firefight with the bombing suspects in Watertown. Here, the report was most critical of off-duty police officers' self-deployment to the scene and the contagious firing of guns. Still, the report gives overall high marks to everyone involved, including volunteers and spectators. My next guests are part of the 4-person team that authored the report. Christine Cole is the executive director of the Criminal Justice and Policy Management Program at Harvard's Kennedy School. And Dutch Leonard is a professor of public management, also at the Kennedy School. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
How did Harvard come to be involved in this? Were you commissioned to do it? Did you do it on your own?
We were certainly interested in it, but we were inspired to do it by with a conversation with a friend and colleague, Ed Davis, who said it would be really helpful and interesting to have somebody who was not part of the response to take a look at what happened.
Was everybody cooperative with you, Dutch? Did you get Homeland Security, the FBI, the Boston Police, the Watertown Police? Did everybody speak to you?
It turned out that everybody we approached was willing to sit down with us, and we felt was very candid. And once we got people started talking about this, they really wanted to share their stories. They wanted to help us to understand, because the issues we were looking at here were about the structure, about the issues, and about the way in which this came together, trying to figure out what the source of the strengths was, and also trying to figure out what we can improve next time. And I think people were genuinely interested in contributing to that.
Well, as you very well established right up front, I mean, this was a fixed event. This marathon was underway. It was, in fact, it was over. You know, the elite runners were well done. And sure, hundreds of people were still coming across the finish line, but the fact that everything was still in place, right from Homeland Security down to the medical tents, they were getting more active because more of those. So you couldn't replicate a scenario like that, really, could you? If it had been Hopkinton or Wellesley, it wouldn't have been the same.
We like to think that with some planning and practice that any community can be better prepared than maybe they are today. Certainly there were things that were not replicable because things happened at the finish line and in Boston. Dutch mentioned the trauma centers.
Eight trauma centers within a couple miles.
Right.
You couldn't just replicate that.
You can't, and so you're drawing attention to something that, even in that terrible moment, there were some elements of good fortune that really contributed to reducing the amount of damage. But the performances that people gave at the finish line, as your overview just showed, were really quite remarkable. The fact that the seriously injured were cleared in 22 minutes, the fact that every person who was alive when they left that scene is alive today, those are remarkable outcomes. And it's actually important to start not just with the bomb, but actually to roll back before that. Because the reason why people were able to give those performances and to save those lives, because there were many fatal injuries, but mercifully only 3 fatalities on that day. The reason for that really lies in the deeper structure of preparation for years in advance. And that's part of what we wanted to call attention to, that was the platform from which that performance sprang, was the hours and hours of, thousands of hours of work people had done in advance, planning 4th of July events and Patriots parades. And all of those things helped to build the relationships, and to build the structure, and to have the people, the commanders, feel immediately the need to come together and to organize and manage the event.
Okay, but that takes me to a few days down the road when...
Exactly.
I mean, you use very tame language, but you know, it fell apart. And there was no plan. That was a chaotic event. It was not a fixed event. It was something that was unfolding, starting as I went through the timeline there with that false report of a robbery at a 7-Eleven. Right. But were you able to determine, either whether you, with any certainty, whether there was, you know, sort of willy-nilly shooting that night, whether there was justifiable shooting at Dzhokhar Tsarnaev once he was discovered in the boat, because it turns out he was unarmed? I mean, did you come to any conclusion about that?
So the purpose of our work was really to look at the larger structural issues of how the agencies were able to coordinate, and rather than to point to specific instances of good or bad performance by individuals. And moreover, our purpose was not to try to do an after-action evaluation or review and to look through the procedures and how things that happened conformed to what people were supposed to do. We're trying to raise a broader set of issues, and it was on that basis that we spoke to people. So we haven't tried to look at the granular level detail of, you know, why shots were fired at the boat in the first instance. What anyone can see or hear listening to that tape, a part of which you just played, is there were an awful lot of rounds fired at the boat, and there's no obvious good reason why many of them needed to be fired. Whether a few of them might have been justified is another matter.
Well, a term you used in your report more than once, which really caught my attention because I used it too, was contagious. I've never heard that term in this context, contagious firing of guns.
You picked up on that word that we did use a couple of times, and I think that's why there's one of the recommendations that we might need to look at new paradigms for training around firearm control and discipline. I'm not a police officer, I haven't been, and I'm not someone who routinely shoots weapons.
But generally speaking, I think the discipline is very good, and police departments practice the individual identification of people that you are shooting at. The expectation is that if you use your weapon, you should expect that deadly results may unfold, and so, you know, people are, I think, generally very careful about that. What was happening in Watertown in the early going in the gunfight was that a very large number of people were suddenly brought together in a confusing situation where there were bombs, explosions going off, and gunfire, and there wasn't any obvious command structure. And so one of the things that we drew attention to is, in contrast to, as you point out, at the fixed event, there's already all that structure in place, and it's been practiced and organized for years. In the kind of event that happens in Watertown, which is, there's no notice to this, there's no such structure in place, perhaps we need a doctrine that says that as people begin to arrive, we want people to come and help, but as they come and arrive, after a relatively short time, they should begin to ask, what is the command structure here? Does somebody need to step back and try to establish command rather than just plunge into the event as the nth+1th police officer?
So we spoke with Colonel Tim Album of the State Police about their security planning efforts for this year, and just want you to listen to a little what he had to say.
You are never going to reduce risk to zero. You're never going to eliminate it. It's always going to be there in some fashion. Because we enjoy so much freedom in this country, we enjoy the ability to go down and watch a parade or attend a fireworks display or an outdoor concert or a ball game or in this case, a marathon route. So
he's making the point that we live in a free society. You're never going to be able to contain every single incident or element or bad part of a society. And even though you have all those recommendations in place, I mean, agreed, there's nothing that they could do if somebody really wanted to do this again.
It seems to me, and I echo what the Colonel said, that we've made a decision as a culture that we're going to risk some level of penetration or failure in order to have the freedom, and that's something that we really value. It's true that the event itself wasn't deterred, but when you think about the response of people on the streets and the emergency folks, the hospitals and the first responders, I think it was a great show of community effort, community resilience, and even community policing.
All right, well, thank you.
I think something we did try to draw attention to in the report is the role that the community strength and the community resilience played. And I think it's enormously important to draw attention to that. And for me, I completely agree with Colonel Albin about this. I think you cannot defend the American way of life by surrendering it. And so there's an inevitable level of risk, and I think we need to be prepared psychologically to accept that. And I think that's part of what Boston Strong is about. It's about the defiance in the face. We are not going to be intimidated. We're going to continue to go about our lives and have a free, fair, open society. And that has its costs, but it has enormous benefits.
All right. Dutch Leonard, Christine Cole, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for having us.